I want to send a kiss to my mother. If my story is chosen, I will watch with her. The stone train departed from Tokyo exactly at the time, as it always happened. I had already traveled a few times on this kind of train and never stopped impressing myself with the almost surgical accuracy with which it moved, as if following a programmed script without margin for errors. It was almost unreal the way he slid down the tracks without any tremor, an almost absolute silence filling the wagon, broken only by the subtle mechanical noise of the structure by cutting the air at impossible speeds. The landscape outside was so fast that my eyes could barely capture the details. Only slips of distant lights and indefinite shadows mingled with the window glass. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and slid my finger by the screen without really focusing on anything. Just one habit, an automatic reflection. The digital clock at the top of the screen marked 10:47 p.m. There was nothing special at that time, nothing that made that moment other than any other night trip. A tiring day of work, a lonely return home, a common trip without any event that deserved to be registered. And yet something in the air made me hesitate before storing the phone again. Something subtle, almost imperceptible, as an echo of intuition warning me to pay more attention. I'd been on a train so fast that it seems that the world out there is not even real. I played by message with a friend, hoping he would respond with some joke about science fiction films or parallel realities. But the answer did not come immediately. Maybe he had already slept. I leaned my head on the glass and left my vision blurred, just feeling the smooth movement of the train. The air conditioning was at the ideal temperature, neither too hot nor cold, just an anesthetizing comfort that made everything even more monotonous. In the wagon, a few people were scattered throughout each other, distant from each other, as if each had isolated himself in a small private universe. Some slept, inclined against the windows, packed by the constant rhythm of the trip. Others looked at their cell phones, immersed on bright screens that discreetly illuminated their faces. A woman ahead was a book with slow, almost mechanical movements, as if she wasn't really reading, but just turning the pages by habit. The electronic panel above the door shone in a bluish hue, indicating the next season. Everything seemed in order, and yet that strange feeling of warning didn't leave me. I stirred my seat, crossing my arms as if I wanted to chase a shiver that made no sense. There was no reason to be restless, but for some reason my mind insisted on capturing details that would normally ignore, like the fact that the man sitting 2 rows ahead seemed completely immovable, his head down, the rigid shoulders as if frozen in time, like the absence of any sound beyond the train, neither a cough, nor a murmur, nor the sound of fingers typing on the screens of the cell phones. My hands were cold. I only realized when I rubbed them each other. I looked out the window once more, trying to distract myself. But the speed of the train made the world out there seemed an indistinct blurring of erased colors. Only the reflex in the glass remained clear, like a translucent mirror projecting the interior of the wagon impeccably. And then it happened. A tiny detail, but enough to freeze my blood by a fraction of a second. The reflection on the glass showed the immovable man in front of me, but his head was erected. I stood trying to understand what I had just seen. I looked directly at him in the real world without any intermediation of the glass. His position had not changed. He was still low, his face hidden by the shadow of weak lighting. I slowly turned my eyes back to the glass. In the reflection, he was looking straight at me. I looked again at the window glass. My reflection was there, as expected. The train cut the night at an absurd speed, and everything inside it seemed normal. The silence was still hanging over the wagon, like a heavy blanket that drowned out any noise, any sign of life besides the slight snoring of the engine under the rails. But there was something wrong, something I couldn't define immediately. I blinked a few times, trying to identify what was bothering me. So I saw it. Across the corridor, reflected in the window, a man wore a dark coat and held a suitcase over his legs. He was still, his head slightly low, his face faded by the dim light of the wagon's weak lights. The detail that bothered me most was not his rigid stance or the fact that he seemed not to move since I entered the train. What made me feel a chill for my background was the fact that, when it turns my head and looking straight at the seat where he should be, He just wasn't there. I stood for a moment, my heart throbbing faster. I looked back at the glass, tried to convince myself that it was a reflection of another passenger, perhaps someone sitting further outside my field of view. But there was no one who corresponded to that reflection, only empty chairs and a silent corridor. I squeezed my eyes, forcing my vision to find some logic in it. Could the glass be reflecting someone from another wagon? Maybe a game of angle that my mind couldn't decipher? It must be just a glass mistake, I muttered to myself, but my voice came out strangely low, almost as if I was afraid of being heard. The suitcase on the lap of the reflected man caught my attention. She looked like leather, a material spent, marked by time. Something about her bothered me, a vague intuition, a growing discomfort that I couldn't explain. When I looked at the reflection again, my stomach turned. The suitcase was open. I had not seen the moment she opened. It just happened. Inside, something dark, kneaded like a piece of folded fabric, heavy, almost oily to the artificial light of the wagon. My chest was heavy. Something inside me shouted not to look anymore. But then, the man's eyes moved. Not in reality, in the reflection. The feeling was instantaneous, as if something had tightened my throat, cutting my breath for a second. My muscles were tense, and a cold traveled my spine. He didn't turn his head. Only the eyes moved slightly toward me, small but impossible to ignore. I locked. Every instinct inside me shouted not to react, not moving a muscle, as if any movement could draw your real attention, bring it to something beyond the reflection. My eyes burned by keeping my eyes fixed on the glass, trying to capture any other detail that would make me understand what was going on. The train was still sliding down the tracks as if nothing had changed. The world outside remained a blur of indistinct lights. In the wagon, people followed immovable, oblivious to that. Gradually, I let out my breath I didn't even realize I was holding. I needed to make sure it was a trick of my mind, any illusion caused by the tiredness or angle of the glass. I moved the hand slowly to the pocket of the coat, pulling the cell phone without turning the eyes off the reflection. The movement seemed absurdly heavy, as if the air around me has become denser. I turned on the camera. If it was just a distortion, a glass error, the screen would show reality. If the reflection should not be there, I would have a test. My finger hesitated before touching the camera button. When the screen illuminated my hand, I felt the air cold around me. The man's reflection was still there, but on the phone screen, the seat where he should be remained empty. My fingers were numb by holding the cell phone. My brain struggled to find some explanation. My breath was heavy, unzipped, and then, in the reflection, I saw something that made me let go of the phone. The man smiled. It was a subtle smile, small, as if only a corner of the lips had bowed slightly. But it was enough. The phone crashed to the floor with a dry thud, but I couldn't even react. My hands were sweating, a cold sweat that stuck to the pants fabric. Every cell in my body screamed for me to look away, but I couldn't. The reflection kept staring at me, and this time the suitcase on his lap was empty. My body was tense. My heart accelerated in a strange way, as if my instinct already knew something that my mind was still trying to ignore. The reflection was still there, immovable, but something in it seemed different. Subtle, like when you see a photo for the second time and realize a detail that had previously gone unnoticed. I swallowed. Did he seem closer? No, it made no sense. I had not seen him move, and the window glass could not simply change the position of a reflection. But the impression was there, stuck like a weight in my mind. It was as if, inch per centimeter, he was approaching without having to leave the place. I blinked a few times, hoping that my eyes were just tired. Perhaps it was an illusion caused by the movement of the train, some game of light and shadow. But when I looked again, I felt a cold tightness in my chest. His smile was gone. Now his face was neutral, but not the quiet way to be expected of someone simply sitting on a train. It was an empty expression, as if he had erased any trace of emotion. I turned my head slowly back, trying not to look obvious. The wagon continued as before. Some people slept, leaning over their own arms or leaning against the windows. Others were absorbed in their cell phones. too dipped in their own bubbles to realize anything around. The woman who flipped the book continued to turn her pages with the same methodical slowness. No one else seemed to notice something strange. Then the electronic panel on the ceiling blinked. The soft sound of sound notifications was lost deep in my mind when I saw the name of the next season. The letters made no sense. It was not a season I knew. It didn't even seem like a real word. The letters looked old, distorted, like kanjis mixed with symbols I had never seen before. Some seemed to flick, as if they were about to change in any moment. I felt a knot squeeze my throat. I looked at the other passengers, waiting for some reaction. Nothing. They did not raise their heads, did not frown, showed no confusion. It was as if that impossible name was perfectly normal for them. I tried to swallow dry, but my mouth was too dry. My whole body began to tingling with growing restlessness, a primitive instinct whispering that something was wrong. Very wrong. That's when I felt something move next to me. Each muscle of my body crashed. My stomach turned. The air around me seemed denser. My first impulse was not to look. Maybe it was just my imagination, an involuntary reflection of fear growing inside me. But I knew it wasn't. The feeling was real. A presence. Someone or something was there. I took a deep breath and, with a slow movement, turned my head just enough to look at the corner of my eye. The seat beside me, which I was sure I was empty when I entered the train, now it didn't seem so empty. There was a subtle weight sinking the upholstery, a light crease on the seat fabric, as if someone was sitting there. But there was no one. Only the outline, the suggestion of an invisible presence. A shiver went up my spine. The train was still sliding down the tracks as if nothing had changed. But for me, everything had. I squeezed my fists against my thighs, trying to control my breath. My brain worked frantically, looking for some rational explanation. Maybe it was just the movement of the train pushing the upholstery down. But then I saw it in the reflection of the glass. The seat beside me was not empty. Someone was sitting there. I didn't have time to sue. The wagon lights blinked. 1, 2, and when they returned to normal, the reflection beside me had turned their heads toward me. The reflection in the window showed the man with a dark coat standing. But in the wagon, there was no one there yet. My muscles froze. Every cell on my body screamed, so I wouldn't look again, so that it would simply close my eyes and expect it to disappear. But I couldn't divert. It was as if something arrested me there, forcing my vision to the glass, forcing me to see what should not be there. He was not only standing, he was turned to me now. The face was still partially covered by the shadows, but his posture had changed. Before, he was just sitting still. Now he looked attentive, present, as if I had finally noticed my existence. The suitcase that held with both hands shaking slightly, an almost imperceptible but constant movement, as if something inside her was trying to leave. The leather of the suitcase seemed to vibrate, expanding and shrinking, a muffled sound echoing from the inside, like a contained whisper. My chest was tight. My heart beat my ribs at an irregular, painful pace. Panic was crawled by my skin like a paralyzing cold poison. The electronic panel blinked again. The distorted lyrics of the ghost station shone with a pale intensity. I didn't know what they meant, but at that moment I was sure I didn't want to find out. It was then that the train did something that should never do. It decreased the speed. In the middle of the route, far from any real season, the sound of the tracks was slower, dragged, as if the train itself is hesitating, trying to decide whether to continue or stop completely. The wagon lights blinked once, twice. In the intermittent darkness, the reflex seemed to move, but without a single sound. Like an old movie being past the picture, my body was rigid. When the lights came back to normal, I didn't see my own reflection in the window anymore. Just his. I should have shouted. It should have raised and run. But all I could do was breathe in an erratic way, my body stuck between the urgency of fear and the impossibility of reacting. My reflection was no longer there. It was as if I had been erased, replaced, as if the window glass now reflected a world where I no longer existed. His silhouette was the only thing visible on the glass. He was closer now, much closer. The dark coat seemed heavier, the wrinkled fabric as if something was riding under it. The suitcase was open. I didn't see when he opened it. She was simply, the interior was not just a dark hole. It was an absolute void, an abyss that sucked the low light around, as if it were made of something that should not exist. Something inside her pulsed, something that made no sound, but that I felt vibrated inside my skull. A silent call that made my stomach turn and my bones hurt. The train was still slowing down. No one in the wagon seemed to notice. They remained real estate, trapped in their mechanical routines. The woman was still flipping through her book, but her eyes were empty now, as if she saw nothing more. And then, in the reflection, the man lifted his head. His eyes had no color. There was no white, there was no iris, only an opaque space, such as matte glass. And he smiled again, a subtle smile, but full of something that made my skin shiver all over. The train was almost stopping. I couldn't let this happen. In a thrust, I looked away from the glass and turned my head at once, forcing me to look straight into the wagon. The bench in front of me was empty. The corridor was empty. But then for the first time that night, I heard a real sound. The dry crack of a suitcase opening. Right behind me, the next thing I remember was the sound of the automatic ad echoing through the wagon. We arrived at our final destination. My body gave a slight bump when I realized that the train was no longer slowing down. It moved gently, as if it had never reduced speed in the middle of the route. The electronic panel above the doors shone with the name of a known station. A normal, familiar name. My eyes were fixed in the window. My reflection was there again. My own face, just as it should be. The same tired eyes, the tense shoulders. The scared expression I refused to admit. Or at least, that's what I wanted to believe. My hands were still cold and moist with sweat. The wagon now seemed like any other bullet train in Japan. The passengers got up calmly, collecting their belongings. The woman who was flipping through the book was already keeping him in her bag. People caught their cell phones, straightened coats, prepared to leave. Everything seemed normal, but something inside me shouted that it wasn't. I got up slowly, feeling the tension in the muscles of my legs, as if I were moving after a long time stopped. When I took the first step to the hall, I felt a slight weight on my shoulders, as if something was trying to pull me back. "Don't look," thought arose in my mind, sharp and clear as a warning. "Don't look back." My hands trembled as I held the backpack strap. My heart beat fast, but my breath was controlled. Or at least I tried to make it look like that. I walked down the hallway without haste, forcing my feet to take constant steps without hesitation. The train doors opened. The air of the season entered the wagon, bringing a familiar smell of metallic rails and cold wind. I took the first step out. It was only when my feet touched the firm floor of the platform that I realized how much my whole body was tensioned. My shoulders relaxed, as if I had just emerged underwater. The sound around me was what I expected from any busy season. Muffled voices, ads echoing in the speaker, hasty steps hitting the tile floor. People followed their ways without realizing my presence, without realizing what had happened inside that train. I was among them now, safe. I looked at the train. The doors were still open, waiting for the last passengers to leave. Outside, under the fluorescent light of the season, the window glass seemed less reflective, less dark. But still, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to leave, to forget. I convinced myself that I had imagined everything, that it was just tiredness, that there was no reason to think about it. But another part, a smaller and more restless part, forced me to look. Just to be sure, I turned to the glass. My reflection was still there, my own face just as it should be, but something was wrong. It was subtle, a small change that I couldn't define accurately. Something in the eyes, something in the way my mouth was slightly bent, as if an almost imperceptible smile was forming, even if I wasn't smiling. I walked away a step, the feeling of discomfort increasing in my chest. Behind me, the train whistled. The doors began to close. The last thing I saw was the glass darkening according to the inner light of the wagon diminished. And for a moment something blinked deep in the reflection. Not my face, something behind him, an indistinct figure, like in shadow, bending in an invisible corridor. The train left. I stood there, looking at the empty space he left behind. People's buzz at the station slowly returned to my perception, but I couldn't focus on any voice in any specific sound. I was back in the real world, but something inside me knew that not completely. Since that night, I avoid looking at my reflection for a long time. I stepped straight through mirrors, deviation the gaze of dark windows. But sometimes when I'm distracted, I still feel that feeling, that presence, as if someone were there, looking at me. And you? Have you seen something in the reflection that shouldn't be there? And this was one of our followers' stories. If you want your story to be told by us as well, leave it in the comments below this video. And if you enjoyed this video and want to see more content like this, we prepared the next video especially for you. Click here to watch it.